This photo is from Berlin. We made a presentation there as that school district was facing very difficult times. Staffing and program cuts had been made that affected the students. Shortly afterward, graphics arts students created this logo and banner and marched with it in a parade in their city. Berlin is a school system in crisis. They've closed their last elementary school, and the young kids are now taught in the high school. At the same time, students in other towns have outstanding facilities and diverse educational opportunities. Our schools are overwhelmingly funded by property taxes. Many taxpayers are having trouble paying those taxes. This affects the elderly who may be on fixed incomes, but it also affects young couples trying to pay student loans and mortgages. At the same time, some taxpayers in other towns are paying much lower property taxes. Taxpayers in different towns are not treated equitably. Students in different towns are not treated equitably. These two problems have been getting worse in recent years. Most importantly, these inequities are unconstitutional. I will start with that point. More than 2 decades ago, the so-called Claremont case was before the New Hampshire Supreme Court on a couple of occasions. The court stated that the Constitution requires the state to provide an adequate education for every child. The court also said that the taxes to pay for education must have a uniform rate across the state. Our purpose is to present information to you that will allow you to judge whether the state is meeting those requirements. Just last year, another suit was filed against the state over the way schools are funded. This suit was filed by the Conval School District and was joined by a few other nearby districts. The Superior Court ruled in favor of the school districts and against the state. In his decision, Judge Ruoff stated that each child has a right to a fully state-funded, adequate education. This is a big picture, a simple pie chart. Last school year, the New Hampshire Public Schools in total required $3.29 billion of revenue. There are two blue portions of the pie. 62% of the revenue came from the local property tax. An additional 11% came from the statewide property tax known as SWEPT. Both appear on taxpayers' bills, and both are retained and used locally. That statewide tax is never sent to the state. It is a renaming of a portion of the local property tax. Altogether, 73% of school revenue is from local property taxpayers. The state provides 17% of the cost through the adequacy aid that was established after the Claremont rulings. Other state aid of about 3% includes building aid and special education aid. Federal funds also support the schools, but that's only 5%. There's a small percentage that comes from other sources. With about 20% of public school funding coming from the state, how does that compare to other states? This chart has one bar for each state, showing the percent of school funding coming from the state. New Hampshire, on the far left, is dead last. Every other state provides a higher percentage than New Hampshire. The median is somewhere around 48%. On the far right is our bordering state of Vermont, where nearly 90% comes from the state. We in New Hampshire are more heavily reliant on the property tax to fund schools than any other state. So how do property taxes compare to other taxes raised in New Hampshire? The far left bar shows the amount raised in 2018 by property taxes, about 3.7 billion. The four components are the local school tax, the municipal tax, the statewide school tax, and the county tax. The light blue bar shows the two business taxes, the business profits tax, the business enterprise tax. While the legislature regularly debates what the appropriate rate for those taxes should be, it also regularly pushes additional responsibilities onto the property tax. The other taxes shown produce even less revenue. The reliance on property taxes has been increasing. In the 10 years from 2008 to 2018, increased revenue for school districts came almost exclusively from property taxes. The state gave 34 million more in adequacy aid and took away 20 million in other aid. Property taxpayers contributed 570 million more dollars. Towns vary in population, in the number of students, and in the value of property within their borders. Comparing the tax burden in each town requires a common measurement. Equalized value per pupil is the measurement. How much property value is there that can be taxed to support the education of each student? Equalized value is the state's way of making sure that local assessing differences are removed. One town may have revalued this year while another may not have done so for 4 years. Equalizing means adjusting for market value changes since the last assessment. It is done annually by the Department of Revenue Administration. Per pupil is the way of being able to compare large municipalities like Nashua and Dover to small towns like Piermont and Sandown. So here is an example. This uses really simple numbers. A town with $1 million of taxable property can impose a $10 tax rate to raise $10,000. Let's say that the $10,000 is to buy new textbooks for 3rd and 4th grade students. A town with only $400,000 of taxable property can only raise $4,000 with that tax rate, so it can't buy that same set of books. To buy the same set of books, that second town must impose a tax rate of $25. This is the crux of the problem when property taxes are used to support schools. The following slides will show the reality. The distribution of property values and the distribution of students are not the same. In New Hampshire, the average equalized property value available to be taxed for each student is $1,118,065. The red line in the center of this table shows that. Londonderry is just above and Merrimack is just below the average. Portsmouth, however, has nearly 2.5 times that state average. Newport has about half the state average. Moultonborough has nearly 20 times the property value behind each student than does Berlin. The result is that some towns can provide their students an education with very low tax rates, and taxpayers in other towns are suffering under a much higher burden. The Sunapee tax of $7.94 raises $30,175 per student. Its immediate neighbor, Newport, has nearly double that tax rate and raises only $8,314 per student. This displays the same information in a few bars. The red line is the state average. You can see that Concord, Derry, Lancaster, and Exeter are below that average. On the other hand, Moultonborough, Portsmouth, Bartlett, and Rye are far above. Berlin is among the lowest in the state. The old mill towns have been suffering for many years. Berlin, for example, has closed its last elementary school. But that is changing. Derry is an interesting example. Derry was a boom town in the 70s and 80s, but now it finds itself even lower than Manchester, and the school system is suffering. The crisis in Berlin is likely to be repeated in Derry and other towns in coming years. This has been getting worse. We tend to think that the collapse of property values in the Great Recession, 2007 to 9, has been recovered. Over the 2007 to 17 period, total property value per student has increased over 40% in Portsmouth, allowing that city to raise funds for each student much easier. On the other hand, there are towns in our state that have less property value per student today than they did in 2007. In those towns, taxpayers have had to choose between cutting back on their schools or suffering higher tax rates. Typically, they have done both. These are two simple examples. Milford and Portsmouth have almost the same number of students. The tax rate in Milford is almost 3 times that in Portsmouth, yet it is spending $2,600 less per pupil. Why? Because it only has 27% of the property value to support each student. The same can be shown for Pittsfield and Rye. Again, both have nearly equal number of students. Pittsfield taxpayers are paying 3.8 times the tax rate as Rye, while Rye is able to spend $8,200 more per student. In a classroom of 20 students, how much more or less do these towns spend than does Portsmouth? Barrington and Somersworth spend more than $100,000 less per classroom than does Portsmouth, but its taxpayers are paying rates that are more than double that of Portsmouth. On the other hand, Newcastle is spending nearly $100,000 more per classroom than Portsmouth, with a tax rate that is less than half that of Portsmouth. At an early presentation of this information in a community forum, we were asked an interesting question. How many students live in towns with below average equalized value per pupil? We investigated. This is the chart that shows the answer. There's one dot for each town, arranged from lowest to highest, not including 10 towns off the chart to the right. The vertical line is the state average. The 133 towns to the left of that line are towns that are below the average. In those towns, 77% of our public school students live. Why is it not 50%? Because all of the cities except Lebanon and Portsmouth are to the left of the line, including Manchester, Nashua, Keene, Somersworth, Rochester. Students are not distributed the same way property value is distributed among our municipalities. Why is this important? Because 3/4 of the state's population is disadvantaged by this dependence on local property taxes. Is it possible to create a coalition of rural North Country towns, old mill towns, one-time boom towns, and fed-up taxpayers everywhere to call for a change? Creating a majority to call for change, along with court decisions noting the unconstitutionality of the current system, could result in a better system for students and taxpayers alike. This issue is not just about schools. It is also about our state's future. We want economic development to be statewide. All of us, regardless of political philosophy, can agree on that. But what business person would choose to locate a new facility in a town with high taxes and suffering schools when more favorable locations are available? Because the property tax burden is such a large percentage of all tax burden, it is a factor in business location decisions. Our system of school funding is steering those decisions to certain communities. Secondly, we know that local elected officials and planning boards think adding workforce housing in their community should be avoided. Why? Because of a concern that such housing might add more to the school needs than tax resources to pay for it. That concern is typically mistaken, but the result is that businesses are finding it hard to recruit young families to come to our state. Thirdly, why can't districts combine and reduce costs through efficiencies of scale? Good question. As the mayor of Berlin, Paul Grenier, responded, what other district would want to combine with us? The fact is that recent changes have been in the opposite direction, breaking up regional school districts and SAUs. And lastly, some properties in towns are either untaxable, such as national forests, state parks owned by nonprofits, etc., or assessed at state assigned valuations far below market value, such as current use. These simply shift the tax burden to other property taxpayers in the same town. Some towns are greatly affected by these, while others are not. What does an adequate education cost? In response to the Claremont decisions, the state legislature created a method to cost the state's responsibility to determine for each district what the states should be sufficient to provide an adequate education. That formula in 2018-19 stated that the cost of an adequate education in Pittsfield should amount to $4,630 per student. We worked with the superintendent and business manager to take their actual 2018-19 budget and pare it down to the state's level. In doing that, we decided to preserve all the core classes. Everything else was reviewed for reduction. So here is what we did. I won't read all of these, I just want to point out some. We eliminated all art, music, and gym classes, all building and grounds maintenance, all field trips, and all athletic programs. We eliminated all bus services. Parents will bring their kids to school and pick them up at the end of the day. We eliminated health insurance on all other benefits for the teachers. We eliminated 5 teachers at the elementary school, 1 of the science teachers, the school nurses, the reading specialist, more than 34 teachers' aides. We eliminated all substitute teachers and 3 special education teachers and all guidance personnel and all librarians and media center staff. We eliminated all technology, classroom supplies, and office supplies. Having made all of those changes, we had cut the budget about in half. But we were still about twice what the state claimed will be adequate for Pittsfield students. At that point, the only thing remaining were those core classrooms. To reduce the budget to the state's stated level required eliminating half of the remaining teachers. At that point, the average class size became about 60 students, and none of those support services and materials remained. Does that make sense to anyone? This slide shows one way in which the inability to raise taxes impacts the schools. First-year teachers with a BA can earn $10,000 a year more in property wealthy districts than in property poor ones. With an MA, the difference is $15,000. So what will a recent graduate do if offered a job by districts on this table? The answer is obvious. After a newly minted teacher has taken a job in a property poor district, the teacher begins to look for an opening in a different district. This is the reason some districts have 1/3 of their teachers turn over every year. Such turnover makes it difficult for the district to have any consistency in curriculum and for teachers to be able to compare notes about the learning style of individual students. Like other changes that we've shown, the problem of disparity in teachers' salaries has been getting worse in recent years. Our small nonprofit is trying to bring attention to this situation and eventually to bring about change. We've made more than 75 presentations such as this one and will continue to do so. Currently, there will be by video presentations to small groups on Zoom or other online media. When the coronavirus situation has dissipated, we will again provide in-person community forums. We have prepared a friend of the court brief in favor of the plaintiff school districts, which the state has appealed to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. That brief is supported by 17 school districts representing 37 towns and 21% of the state's public school students. We are active on numerous fronts and plan to become more so in coming months. These are opposite sides of the same coin. We believe that students should be treated equitably and taxpayers should be treated equitably. Thank you.